All right, today we are talking about the Odyssey. I am Chris Vander, filmmaker, tastemaker, cinematic wunderkind of all kinds, and here to discuss the Odyssey with me is
Dan Scully, filmmaker, funny guy, writer, logistics coordinator, friend, lover of nature and animals. Just an international sex symbol right here. But
now, now that we've oversold ourselves for what we're ultimately going to deliver. So today we're talking about the Odyssey, which is the latest magnum opus from Christopher Nolan. $250 million budget, I think they said.
yes,
And
250 million, and it's already broken that at the box
I
office.
was going to say, yeah, we're not even out of the opening weekend as we record this, and it's already basically got that much money. So I think we can safely say this was a success for Mr. Nolan. Speaking of Mr. Nolan, because this is his newest film, I'm curious, what's your journey or your take on Nolan? Have you always been a fan? Are you not a fan? Like, where do you land with Christopher Nolan?
Big fan. I like most of his movies. I think even his lesser movies are still super interesting. I love what he does in terms of fighting for the craft aspect. I love that he's committed to using film. I love that he's used his clout to take something like, oh, we're shooting this all on film, we're putting it in IMAX, and he turned that into like an event thing. And in a world where every event movie is some sort of IP or anything like that, he does these original movies and turns them into event films. A biopic of Oppenheimer should not be a explosive blockbuster like it was, but it was. You know, an epic poem being adapted into yet another Swords and Sandals epic should not be the next Barbenheimer, but it is. So yeah, I love Nolan. I think he's so cool, and he's made really great movies, I think, since day
Yeah,
one.
I have an interesting sort of a roller coaster journey with Nolan, where I was a huge fan of his from the first film I discovered of his, which was it wasn't Following. I didn't see that till years later, but it was Memento. Was the first one I saw. Loved
Same.
that. Liked Insomnia, and there was a point in the middle where I wasn't as bowled over by his stuff. Like technically, it's always been good, and it's interesting that you say the thing about the technology, because for a while I had like a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about Nolan, because it felt very much like he was sort of both a combination of a purist and a luddite, in the sense that he, like it felt like he thought I was lesser for working in digital video, and like I was like, I don't like that. And what's funny is it's sort of come around full circle in the world that we live in now, where I'm like, thank God for the purist and the luddite, who still remembers how to do things, because the industry is slowly forgetting how to do everything, and everything costs a ton of money. And so he's like one of the last people that, like, I think surrounds himself with talented people who know how to do their job still. And so I have sort of come full circle, and it turns out he was right in the long run, especially as we're watching stuff like, AI invade into the space, like someone who wants the human at the helm of everything, including the way that the film is processed. So I think that's great. And the only thing I would ever say about Nolan is, like, I Dunkirk's the only one I've never seen. It takes a lot for me to watch a war movie. So, but that's the only one I've not seen. And I was I wasn't a huge fan of Tenet, only I think for different reasons than other people. I know there's a lot of complaints about the sound mix, but my big thing was just I had a really hard time. He does this thing I kind of love sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't work for me, which is, what if we take a silly premise and then we take it deadly serious? And he's
Yeah,
done
yeah,
that a
yeah.
few times. He does that with Batman. He does that with Inception, which is going into dreams, and so he does this a lot of times. The distance I was not able to go with him was the reverse chronology elements in Tenet, watching things happen backwards, a backwards car race, and the temporal pincer move. Like, all I could think of in the theater was like the wacky sax playing behind it. Like, it was very goofy to me, and I couldn't overcome that. And I recognize that I'm in the minority on that. But that one, and then Interstellar, which is a very accomplished movie, but I couldn't find a way into it emotionally. But other than that, I've liked everything else that he did.
I
So
feel like
that's
that's a
kind of,
common thing. A lot of people talk about how he's tough to get into emotionally. Because I agree, sometimes he's so obsessed with craft that you lose some of that emotionality. Like, I like Tenet, but that is just a clinical plot movie. It's just plot on plot on plot. There's really not much by way of story.
yeah.
It
Well,
kind of
and
opens up if there's a Tenet 2, Tune It, where if there was a Tenet 2, there's story to be had there, because the two lead characters meet each other at the end.
yeah,
And it's like, oh,
yeah.
well, now we have ourselves a story.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because I do think one of the things he's very good at is constructing elaborate machinery that is interesting to watch, but not always, for me, super compelling to watch. But not always. I mean, very often I'm fully on board. Memento, I think, was a great example. But that's kind of what I meant about the dip in the middle. Is it was a lot of the stuff sort of, well, I guess that's not exactly the middle. Interstellar and Tenet were more recent, but that sort of has always been, if I had an issue, that was the issue that I had. But that moves us now to his most recent film.
Well, I
Obviously,
want to
Oppenheimer doesn't fall in. What's that?
before we jump on the Odyssey, I wanted to point out something. You mentioned that there you had an air of like, oh, I feel like he's like holier than thou for digital filmmakers, like you had felt that for a while. It's funny though because he's like a Paul Thomas Anderson, where you go, what have you seen lately that's good? And he's like Tokyo Drift all day. Like Nolan has been on record saying he just like loves Tokyo Drift, the same way that PTA was like, don't go to film school, watch Terminator. And it's like you think of these guys, they're like, oh yeah, we do high art and all that, and then you ask them their favorites, and they love the same, bubblegum crap that we all love.
Yeah,
And
well, I mean,
where the filmmaking's on point.
yeah, well, I mean, didn't he was the one that hosted a panel for the TV, what was the TV show, The Curse, that
Yeah,
Nathan Fielder made. Like, he loves
I still have to watch
weird
that.
stuff. So like, it definitely wasn't. I don't think, that was obviously more a perception of me as a tiny filmmaker being mad about a guy who made it big by sticking to his principles.
I have
So
been that
screw
guy
him.
so many times, so
Yeah.
don't worry.
So, but at least I can be the bigger man, well, the much smaller man, by saying that I clearly could see that was a chip on my shoulder. But anyway, so what was interesting to me was that there was a shift from Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer does not fall into the category of the previous films I was talking about, which is the let's take something silly and take it very seriously. It was obviously something that was very serious, and I thought he was equal to the task in that film. And I also think that it's not the first film where he had fully assembled an amazing post-production team, but like I think it was where he finally had everybody he needed in place to deliver the exact film he wanted, so that all of the machinery was moving. And this is largely the same creative team working on the Odyssey. So let's go ahead and dive into the Odyssey. Do you want to just start with like the big picture? What did you think on a whole scale? How did you feel about the movie?
I mean, this is one I started writing a review of it, and the first couple lines of my review are, it almost feels unfair to have to review this after just one viewing
Mm-hmm.
because it's so much movie. It's a whole hell of a lot of movie. This seems to be happening a lot where the 70 millimeter is not projecting correctly. There's been sound sync issues. So it was like, okay, we can either start this press screening in 3 hours at midnight, or we can do laser IMAX. So we did laser IMAX, and it sufficiently blew my mind. But with that background, like I came to it looking for that craft element and ended up finding myself pretty moved by the story. And the Odyssey is, it's an epic poem, which is by definition plot on plot on plot. And it's just an and then story. And I asked myself, is Nolan going to do his time jump thing? Or is he going to do an and then movie, which is not his style? And he ended up doing this awesome time jump thing that elevated story elements that I don't think I would have seen otherwise. And so my big takeaway from the first viewing was that I kind of sat down with the idea of like, I'm just going to let this one punch me in the face. I'm going to let it wash over me and I'll think about it later. But within the first 2 hours, which is a crazy thing to say, I was sitting there like, I really started to care. Even though I love Nolan, that's kind of a new thing for me.
Yep,
Like
100%.
that feels new where I'm not against a plot over a story-based movie. And he always felt like radio to me, where it was like, we're going to hit you with all the sounds and all this and all that and just create this reality. Plot can come, or story can come later. But I was very stunned by how much I cared about Odysseus, how much I was like pissed off at the suitors. Like I really ended up caring, and that's new, and I was very impressed by that.
Yeah, there was a level of sincerity to the storytelling, the original story as it was told, and wanting to capture that felt. And I don't want to take credit for this. I'm trying to remember where it was that I heard somebody else pointed out that so many of Nolan's movies are minor variations on the themes of the Odyssey throughout his entire career. Trying to
Hmm.
get back to your wife, the great man on a mission, like all of these elements that are part and parcel of the Odyssey that have obviously influenced a ton of stories, not just his. But like you can see, because I think he was supposed to direct Troy, or he was in the conversation to direct Troy many years ago, and didn't pan
Really?
out. He went off and he made Batman. And what's interesting to me is it feels like a thing that may have just been sitting in the back of his head working this whole time. And what we're getting in this movie is the culmination of a filmmaker who maybe knew he wasn't ready to tell that story but wanted to, and has learned the craft to I think as sufficient a degree as you can as a person, as a filmmaker, and then delivered the thing that he wanted to do all those years ago, but maybe wasn't prepared for. To your point, he did something, because you said something about the structure of the storytelling, which I really loved, which is it was sort of nested flashbacks contained within a
Yeah.
modern day, well, not modern day, but like in the present tense story. And what I loved about that is that the nested flashbacks essentially built it as Odysseus telling his story, other people telling Odysseus' son his story. And the way that it ended up working out was very much like the creation of the story, the Odyssey itself, which was passed down in the oral tradition of someone telling the story to people, them remembering the things that they liked and then orating it to someone else. Like, we don't have the original version of the Odyssey. We have the version that was eventually written down. And so what's interesting to me about that is the way that he constructed the movie perfectly reflects the circumstances by which the story originally came about to begin with.
I didn't even think about that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
He sort of did like a narrative pincer move. No, no, that's true, and I think that's probably what caused the character elements to really elevate. Because again, and I keep landing on this, it kind of eliminates the and then and then and then of all of
Mhm.
it. I always hate in a movie when there's and I'll use this as an example. Even though I'm a defender of Batman versus Superman, but it is an egregious offender of a character. Like, they'll end a scene where a character is like, "Clark Kent, where is that guy?" And then it cuts to the next scene, and logic dictates we're gonna check in on Clark Kent, but then we don't. It like jumps to another thing, and it's like that's where something like that fails. And this found a lot of, like, Odysseus, where is that guy? Get him in my office. And then we cut to and check in with Odysseus. And to me, that's very smart writing. I mean, it's basic writing, but, for all of Zack Snyder's skills, I feel like narrative structure isn't always one of them.
Yeah.
But Nolan
Well,
found it here.
and to your point, though, about Nolan, what's interesting here is that while he does have several of his flourishes and tricks that he likes to use in his films, there is I don't want to say subdued at all, because that makes it sound bad, but there is definitely, it feels like a fealty to traditional classic storytelling elements in this movie, because of course it's the oldest story in the world. And I think what he recognized was, like, there are bones here that you would be stupid to remove, that you would be stupid to change, just in aid of trying to make it a new hip thing to get an audience, and
Hmm.
so what I liked about that is, as much as he brought certain elements, adaptational elements to it, he also just recognized, like, when you have a beautiful Tudor home, you don't rip it down to the studs and rebuild. You know what I mean? Like, you add to it, but you give it its original structure, because it was beautiful as it was made. And I thought
Yeah, you got to let
that
it do
was
its work.
yeah, exactly. So I wanted to talk to you about one of the big changes he did make, actually, and this has been a little bit of a subject in conversation. I know, to the point that they even brought it up with Tom Holland, which is the idea of the choice to do, I guess you would call it sort of like a flat, uninflected Midwestern style American accents, and to somewhat pepper in modern colloquialisms and speech and stuff like that
Like,
into the
so
way
I
that they
was
spoke.
hanging out with the sirens, and
Yeah,
they were singing real loud, and it made me want to fall in love with them. It was really wonderful, but it was hard to do.
yeah,
That's the
exactly. So it reminds me of the Tony Curtis in was it in Spartacus? The House of My Fada. But, like, so I'm curious what you thought about it. One of the things I liked about it was that it did the one thing that I felt like was going to be the biggest lift, which is, can you tell a story that still takes place in its era and not have it feel remote and difficult to wrap your head around as a modern audience member? And I think this was the small gimme that he had that allowed us to feel like he didn't dumb down the story, he didn't dumb down the characters, and he didn't, frankly, dumb down most of the dialogue. He added certain words in that were like familiar islands to us, and speech patterns that were familiar to us. I think John Bernthal is a great example of, like, a guy that could not have had the role he had if you'd asked him to do this with a British accent. Like, what
Mhm.
he was doing would not have worked if we all decided we were going to do sort of like the generic Shakespeare accent that everybody does.
Well, that's the thing. Like, I feel like when we talk about, like, oh, the reality of this, it's like, first off, it's an epic fictional poem with beasts and beasties. So there's actually no real reality to tap into. And this weird thing that we've decided as a culture, that anything that happens before 1900 must happen with a foppish British accent with liquid U's and things like that. It's like, that's not accurate either. We've just culturally accepted that to be the all-purpose catch-all way of speaking for
Mm-hmm.
anything ancient, which has as much basis in reality as if Odysseus was like, "Hey, y'all, coming back from Troy." Like it's just as real. So to me, to have it be spoken in such a way that is more contemporary doesn't change the reality for me because it's just as fictional as anything else. Less distant from how people would speak in ancient Greece than any of the other things that we've accepted as common.
Exactly.
And
Yeah. So the only change is that to make it more relatable to the people who are now watching it, in the same way that storytellers throughout the eras have influenced the story to whatever era they're in to make it connect with them.
And I think of something like, you look at Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, where they didn't really change the text that much, but it's like, oh, it's not even about the what is being said, it's about how it's being said. I mean, another great example of this, I know he's like He Who Shall Not Be Named, but when Joss Whedon did, was it Much Ado About Nothing?
Much Ado About Nothing. Yep.
And that was all, like original text, but you didn't actually have to decode it because the way people spoke about it with contemporary inflections ended up selling you on what everything means. And to me, that has it doesn't pull me out of it. It actually draws me in. And I think that worked here for this. If everybody was, because like we said earlier, like Nolan loves to do the what if this ridiculous thing but real. And I think that that's where, like, I like his Batman movies, but they're not my favorite because the answer to the question, what if Batman was in the real world, what would that be like, is, well, that wouldn't be like because there's no real world that can house an actual Batman. And so you watch those movies, and there's all these little concessions that they have to make of, well, this has to be fake because this is fictional. You can't have a Batman, which nullifies the idea of Batman in the real world. So it's
Right.
kind of fighting against itself the whole time.
It spoils its own theoretical exercise. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, it's like I'd rather Batman Returns where magical cats bring Catwoman back to life because that's the world where a Batman could take place. I need that. And so, same thing goes for the Odyssey, where it's like, yeah, we could commit to outright realism, and that's just not going to work once a Cyclops shows up. So, whatever it takes in terms of acceptable falsehoods that draw me into the story rather than push me out because they're so committed to reality is a good thing. And so, the way people speak to one another and the way that they use sort of not modern parlance, but modern cadence,
Cadence. Yeah.
that to me is a really good idea because you're accepting to do this real is not possible. So let's do it accessible with an eye towards making this as clinical as possible in terms of the real elements. And like that's something that also feels a little bit new for Nolan, for him to be happy in that middle ground rather than committing to fantasy or reality. I don't think he's done it so well since like I mean my favorite movie of his is The Prestige, and The Prestige is almost studying exactly that of are we going all magic or are we going let's pull a trick? And that's that whole thing's about, and I think he finally found that middle ground here.
Yeah. Well, and he even opens this movie. This film takes place in a time of apparent magic, right? And
Hmm.
apparent can mean two things. It can mean you can see it, or it can mean it seems like it's magic. And that's a
Yeah.
sort of a clever choice of words that he used there, that allows you to have, like you said, that sort of that murky middle ground of the ambiguity of where it lands. Let's talk about, like you just said, the people who are using the language in the movie. Let's talk about some of the performances. Were there any standouts for you? What was your big takeaway with the performances?
I mean, I thought this was kind of like really well performed across the board and really well cast. I'm not always sold on Tom Holland. I like him as Spider-Man. I think he's a good actor, but I have a hard time not seeing Tom Holland. I think he was cast here to sort of be an outlier while everyone's chewing scenery around him. And I think I have to see it a second time to see how I really feel about it. But like he I think he exists to get chewed by just to get destroyed by Pattinson, who's in a
Yeah.
completely different movie than everyone, but is supposed to be. He's great in this. But I mean, the real big standouts for me were probably Anne Hathaway,
Hmm.
who I always liked, but like she's sort of a big actress the way like a Kate Blanchett is. And she got to use her big acting, but she did a lot of really interesting face stuff, which worked, and I think really worked in the IMAX as well because you can see all of that. And I think another one was Samantha Morton. One scene, one small role, but like, ooh, I was scared of her. I pitied her. It was that was a really intense scene. I think she sold it. And then, of
Yeah.
course, I'll say it right
MVP of
now:
the
Matt
movie for
Damon's
me.
getting the Oscar.
I totally agree with you with Samantha Morton. Like, I used to be insulted when people would get nominated for Academy Awards for performances that are like 6 minutes in a film because I'm like, come
Yeah,
on,
yeah.
there were other people that did a lot of work here. But watching Samantha Morton take the journey that you just talked about, being terrifying, being pitiable, and just the layer of nuance in her performance, but also the performance being very big while being nuanced at the same time, it's a Herculean feat. And to do it in the amount of
Eh?
screen time that she had, and to be that memorable in the middle of a 3 hour film, to the degree that when I came out, I was like, the MVP of this movie is Samantha Morton. It was phenomenal, phenomenal work. He's the only person in the movie that was like, everybody else was playing it, like not exactly method, but closer to like tapping into the emotional core of this person in an important way. And it very much felt like Pattinson was really excited to have like the modern version of like a silent movie mustache twisting villain
He,
guy.
oh, he would have been right at
Literally,
home in
like
one of
there
the
are scenes where
Harryhausen movies.
he pops around from the pole and goes, "Get the swords, get the." You're
Yeah,
like, "I'll carry your groceries." It's a perfect tone for that guy because we have to hate him. We don't have a ton of screen time with him, and we need to, when the comeuppance comes, to like really relish it. And he perfectly landed that. But back to Damon. One of the things I think is fascinating about Matt Damon, has always been about Matt Damon, is that he's just a very likable person. He doesn't usually play a villain, or if he does, he's the villain that you're kind of like, talented Mr. Ripley. I'm like, I'm kind of on board with him most of the
yeah.
way. And
Oh,
every
it's
once in a while,
important
I'm
you
like,
fall in love
you know
with
what,
Ripley.
though? He's wrong, but is kind of how you feel all the time with him. But that's, again, I think what works really well about this story is because I think for people who haven't read this story in a long time, and I hadn't read the Odyssey in a long time, you forget that this is the hero's journey. This is like one of the original hero's journeys. But you also forget that this hero does, most of the things he does are not heroic. They're stupid, they're egocentric, they're selfish, in some way. And that's a very delicate needle to thread for a character you have to watch for 3 hours, who you supposedly want to get home and get back to his family, where he keeps making dumb fucking decisions or cruel decisions or bad decisions. And Matt Damon is maybe the only guy that I can see that I'm fully on board with all the way, even as I'm watching him do this dumb shit. Like, because it's him, because of the way that he performs. And in some ways I almost wonder, like, was Matt Damon the cast, was that the reason that they decided to go with the American accents across the board? Because they were like,
Maybe.
Matt Damon is only going to work playing the guy that we know as him. He can't, I mean, I'm not saying he can't do a British accent. I'm saying that the second you do that, it pulls it out of what makes Matt Damon's alchemy magic work?
I mean, I'll say it. I bet Matt Damon cannot do a British accent.
But
I
that's
want
the
to
thing.
see
The magic of
Odysseus with
Matt
a
Damon is
Boston
that
Boston accent.
we can watch a person make terrible decisions for 2.5 hours of a 3 hour movie and never not be with him. And like, that's a very difficult thing to surmount. And it's also like, it's deceptively simple. What he's doing on screen is it's not simple, but it seems simple. His performance seems simple, and that's really the magic of it, and what I hope will not cause it to not get noticed. When you can't see the wheels working, sometimes they don't give actors the credit that they deserve. You
A
have to
friend of
see
mine
the
always
acting in
talks
order for it to
about
be impressive.
the Oscars. They don't always award the best acting, they award the most acting.
Exactly.
And he's not doing the most acting, but he's doing very good, subtle acting. So that, if anything sinks him, it'll be because of that or just some other performance we don't know about yet. But
Yeah.
if I was a betting man, and I'm not, I would put some cash on Damon taking home the gold next year for this. I There's a funny thing in the world of comedy that Matt Damon is the one guy that no one can do an impression of because he doesn't have a thing. No
That's
one can
interesting.
isolate the thing. Everyone can do Chris Walken to some degree. Everyone
Right.
does Arnold Schwarzenegger. What's a Matt Damon? No one
That's a good
knows.
point.
No one can figure it out.
He is every man because he is no man.
He is no man. And like that doesn't mean he's a blank slate where we project onto him. He's got the gravitas. He can create these compelling characters. But the second someone's like, "All right, Matt Damon at a dentist's office ordering, you can't do it. It's never going to happen." And
Right.
never say never, but I know I've tried. I'm not really an impressionist, but he's like he's the impression everyone wants and no one's going to get.
That's fascinating. And now that you say that, I'm just going to sit every time I watch a Matt Damon film now, I'm going to look for, the tells, right? That's what they call it in
Yeah.
poker, is the tells. I'm going to see if I can find any of them. Not that I
Yeah,
can
I've
do
been doing it
impressions
for
either, but now.
years.
Yeah.
Every time I watch him, I go, there it is, that's the thing. And then I think about it later and I go to do it and I go, that wasn't a thing. I
No.
can't latch onto that. There's
That's
nothing
funny.
here.
So let's dive into something that I think, and starting with Damon is obviously the right place to do it for this film because it's one of the many themes that has run throughout Nolan's career, which is the extraordinary man canon, right? Like so many of his films are about an extraordinary man, both extraordinary in the sense of them being better or more capable or more accomplished than other figures, but also extraordinary in that they have an outsized impact on the people and world around them, sometimes in positive and sometimes in very negative ways.
Interesting. Okay.
Where do you see this one falling in that? So like, well, let's take an example for, I think Batman is a great example. That trilogy ultimately argues that Batman was an extraordinary figure in the sense that the thing he wanted to fix, he ended up making worse in the world, right? By putting on the costume, by going out into the world, he created the other monsters that saw that as an endorsement of them doing the same. And ultimately, the way he had to solve it was to stop and leave and go be happy in his life with the woman that he loved and give up that thing, right? Stop doing the thing that you thought you were called to because that is what is causing the problem in some ways. Oppenheimer, I mean, we don't even have to discuss what in Oppenheimer is the extraordinary man and how it impacted the world, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
that's very clear. We knew
That
before
final line.
Nolan's movie, but he just codified it. But I'm curious, do you see like what I saw is the extraordinary man element of the Odyssey story?
I I never thought about it in terms of the phrase extraordinary man, but I think that that's apt. The way I thought about it was more like action based of I broke the code that we all silently agreed to in order to obtain a short-term victory. And in doing so, the world that I thought I was saving is now indelibly different. So they do it in The Dark Knight quite literally when he does that cell phone thing. And
Mm-hmm.
Lucius Fox is like, all right, I'll help you this one time, but I can't go down this road with you because this breaches the agreement of humans and their privacy. It's the whole thing of Oppenheimer is we had to get the bomb first, we had to show we were willing to use it, and now we live in a world where that's something that can always happen from everybody, and it's my
Yeah.
fault. You look at the prestige, and it's I figured out a way to skip learning prestidigitation, and now every single night there's a chance I might die on stage. You know, in Insomnia, it is I accidentally broke the rules of being a cop and killed this guy. And instead of owning up to it, I'm now covering it up, and I now no longer have the world where the morals are something that we can trust. It's
Yeah.
consistent throughout all, even in
Yeah.
Memento, it's
Well,
I
I
have
was
the opportunity to put an end to this, but it's much more satisfying to me in the short term to ignore the fact that the solution I'm seeking is impossible to grab. The same thing, it starts quite literally with the idea of the Trojan horse, which is we broke the rules of combat, and now we live in a world where subterfuge is the way to win a war. Saying I'm not going to tell him what's inside the horse because I need him to believe. And then we find out later, he's like, "Why didn't you tell me?" And he's like, "I probably should have told you." You know, and like so it's all of these little things of like I'm going to step out of the way of propriety because and this is where the extraordinary man comes. I'm the one who can be trusted with this power. Therefore I will wield it this one time and then we'll go back to normal. Then you do it and you find out that there's no normal to go back to and it's your damn fault. And that kind of happens repeatedly when they go into when they avoid the whirlpool and go into the channel,
the
and
rivers.
then
Yeah.
octopus thing starts sucking people up and they're like, you knew about it. And he's like, yeah, and it was either those five people or all of us. I had to do it. But now we live in a world where they might mutiny. You know, like there's that breach of trust keeps happening because the extraordinary man goes beyond what is acceptable because he is self-diagnosed as extraordinary in a way. And I think that is just talking it out now and spitballing. That seems to be the defining theme of all of Nolan's work. I mean, even Tenet, the protagonist doesn't get to know what his mission is until the movie's over. And it's everyone else going, we've constructed this elaborate thing and we actually can't tell you what it is or else you'll die. So you just kind of have to go with it. But now he's at a point where it's like, I can't trust anything that's going on because I might be best friends with this guy and I don't know it yet.
Yeah. Well, the thing you said about the Trojan horse, to me, that's the most brilliant part of the movie for me thematically. What they did with the right, what you were talking about, the recontextualizing of the Trojan horse, because I think it's gotten lost in conversation now that what a Trojan horse is, what we think of it now, is a clever way to win a battle instead of having to do it the old way, where you had to stand outside and you had to fire arrows and everything. And in some ways, we kind of look at it as we sort of tip our hat to Odysseus as, hey, that was a smart play, nice work, you're a brilliant leader. And what this movie did, I think, very effectively was to say that short win is in. There's that meme of the little domino that hits the big, that hits the, and then the giant thing toppling over. That is what this movie is saying, is that the single victory he needed because he was tired of being on that beach and wanted to get home to his wife is essentially what shattered the contract that kept civilized societies from crumbling.
Hmm.
And that is as that is as important a message as is possible to give in today's world. I mean, arguably in
Absolutely.
any world, but right now I feel like there are a lot of things that are on fire right now, and there are places we can trace it back to. And largely, what I think he's saying in the movie is there were people who knew that their shortcut would probably be damaging, and they did it anyway because it was a shortcut, because it was an easier way to get to the thing they wanted. And it feeds back into the whole idea we were talking about earlier of him being supportive of the way that film was made before, and not just diving onto a technology because it's easier and cheaper, but really digging into whether or not that's of benefit to the art form or benefit to society. Like there are just so many things that this very old story he has recontextualized to be utterly important in today's day and age. It's fascinating to me.
It's I was talking to fellow critic, so shout out to Joshua Rivera, who I've become acquainted with, and he said something. I'm going to get his wording wrong, but I'll get the concept right. He said something to the effect of Nolan likes to make movies about how we're destroying the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a simplification, but it is true. And it's almost in a way fated that because of our blessings as humans, our ability to communicate at the level that we do, our ability to be deceptive the way that we do, it's hard coded into us. And at a larger scale, when it comes to success and growth, that has to be factored in. And it's something that we almost can't help ourselves but to do. Like I think of something like, the Patriot Act back in the day. When that first came out, it was controversial because everyone was like, this is a level of surveillance that isn't really cool. And the powers that be, and I think in a lot of ways valid, said, listen, this is an emergency situation, and we need this to prevent another 9/11 from happening. It's temporary, we'll get through it. It's not temporary. And now we're at a point where we've all just went, yeah, whatever, I'm on camera all the time, what are you going to do? And like, in one way I go, it would have been good if we all stood up and said, absolutely not, this is not appropriate. But now in hindsight, it's like it almost feels inevitable. There was no stopping this because that was just factored in. I hate to have this defeatist mentality, but it's like if Odysseus didn't do the Trojan horse, somebody was going to come up with that.
Yeah.
Someone was going to
Well,
come up with some sort of sneaky thing. Guerrilla warfare always wins. And the reason it always wins is because it works. But it only works until the next person comes up with an even better way of doing guerrilla
yeah.
warfare.
Well, and
You
that's
get in a fight and you bring a knife. It's like, yeah, you might stab the guy, but guess what? Now you're in a fight where knives are involved.
yeah.
Can't go back from that.
Well, and it's interesting because you would think, based on everything that we're talking about, that the movie ultimately would maybe be pessimistic in its view. But what I think is really remarkable in the end is that the long view that the characters have, and I think obviously that Nolan has about the story, is that the movie is talking textually about, they're hinting at the idea that the dark ages are coming, right, but that it's not going to stay dark forever. That's the text of what they're talking about at the end, that people won't remember but it will come back. But what he, I think he's ultimately talking about is that is the cycle for humanity always, right, which is that we think inevitable things that will change us forever and that we can't go back will end up causing a big enough problem that things implode on itself, and then we have to rebuild. And the rebuilding is the point at which we get it right, at least for a little while.
I
And
mean, that's the American way for sure. We never make positive changes until we blow it first, and then
right,
we
exactly.
fix it. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, like the idea of incremental change is a great idea, but it almost never works because incremental change is boring. Incremental change isn't seen fast enough, and so oftentimes what it takes is the implosion and terrible things in order to rebuild better. But
We're
I
living it,
think there
baby.
is an
We're
inherent
living it.
hopefulness. Yeah, exactly. I think yeah we're in phase two of that three-step phase. I think ultimately what I came away with in this movie was also something that I don't often find in Christopher Nolan's movies, which is a sense of like humanist optimism at the end of the story that like you know individual humans might not be okay and maybe all of humans might not be okay but humanity eventually will be okay, and there is
Mhm.
a sense of hopefulness in that idea. This movie it caught me off guard. I think you said it was more emotionally resonant than you expected from a Nolan film, and I felt exactly the same way. Is it perhaps because it's one of the oldest stories in the world? We've all read it. We read it when we were children and probably in college, and so it's so baked into us that it's easy to see the universal emotional elements. Or is it just that he, was on a different frequency than he was on his other stuff? I don't know, but this definitely really hit home to me more emotionally than a lot of his other projects ever did.
I think we kind of nailed it in terms of like it's clear that this shows as the ultimate culmination of all of the things he's been working on for his entire career. All of his thematic obsessions, all of his craft obsessions, all of that kind of came to a point here in a way that I mean, he probably didn't even expect it, and who knows what'll come
Yeah.
next. But because even
Exactly.
like
I'm
I
sure
found
he's probably
Interstellar.
feeling that pressure now. You know what I mean?
Oh
Like,
yeah,
yeah,
he's gonna
like
make Odyssey
how
too.
do I follow this up?
Odysseus, Odysseus returns. Bane takes over
Yeah.
Troy and talks in the way
I
he
mean,
talks.
I suppose there is the Iliad if he's really looking for something next.
I mean, after this, I'm totally down. Like, I found uh, I found some hope in Interstellar, but it's a weird, like, tragic hope
Yeah.
where this guy trades all of the time in his entire life that he could be spending with his family in exchange for saving the entire world. And like that's a huge sacrifice. I think that I love that movie, but I think that it's a little like ham-fisted in that way. And it's funny because like I would expect something like the Odyssey to traffic more in the world of ham-fistedness
Right.
than something like Interstellar. But I don't know, just the alchemy came together for this one.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about some of the individual like scenes and sequences in the movie because I think there's some really spectacular stuff in here. The Cyclops sequence. Let's start with that one because I think it was one of the ones that was most talked about before the film even came out was because of
Yeah,
the elaborate nature of constructing it. But so first of all, almost everything in this film is practical. We can say that before we dig into any of the rest of the sequences. Almost everything was done practically in some way. And in the case of the Cyclops, it was done, I guess, a combination of puppets, I would assume probably some forced perspective photography, and then the performance of Bill Irwin, one of the great unsung performers in movie history. Probably the first thing I ever saw him in was Robin Williams' Popeye movie. He
hmm
was in that, fantastic performance in that.
I
But
loved that movie as a
he's a
kid. I was
fantastic
obsessed with that.
physical performer. Yeah, yeah. The scene I remember the most is the Bill Irwin one where they squish him down
Yes, yeah,
and then
yeah.
they have to stretch him out later. Oh, it's so good.
What a weird movie.
Yeah. But so Bill Irwin's performance is interesting, and I even heard Christopher Nolan talking about the idea that some sort of influence that Guillermo del Toro had on him about the idea that monsters can't just be impediments to a character getting somewhere. They have their own feelings and emotions and journey. And I absolutely feel you can see that in every chapter, every character or every obstacle that they ran into. It feels like Nolan worked very hard, maybe no more than in the Cyclops sequence, to humanize a monster so that by the time everything befalls itself at the end of the sequence, I don't know how you felt about it, but my big takeaway was like, I feel bad for the Cyclops, and I'm kind of pissed off at the way that Odysseus ended all of this, like the way that he handled what we did at
100%.
the end.
I felt bad that he couldn't see. I was like, oh, he's only got one eye and you took it.
Yeah,
And he,
the sequence where like before he left, just because he was mad, he had to fire another arrow at him, and then he ended up getting even more of his guys killed because he shot the poor blind guy. And then the blind guy raged and tried to like grab whatever he could, and like he was hurt and he was confused and he was still being attacked even though they were free. And that's what I was talking about earlier about the idea that like Odysseus continues to make these terrible decisions, and we're never fully off board with him because I think of Matt Damon's performance, but man, he just keeps pushing it.
that that sequence has drawn some ire from purists because of the nobody pun. Are you familiar with that? Do you remember
Mm-hmm.
that from the text?
Yep.
because that was cut out of the movie, and apparently Nolan said he just couldn't figure out a way to make it work. So for the those who are not in the know that are listening, there was a pun in the original text where Odysseus tells the Cyclops that his name is Nobody, so that after he shoots the Cyclops, later the Cyclops is yelling out to the other creatures of the night, if you want to call them that, and says, "Nobody shot me," and they all go, "Okay, well then you're fine." And that's the clever way that Odysseus is able to get out, is through that lie. They cut that from this, and I think a lot of people were upset because that's like an important piece of sort of the thematic weight of the original poem. And but I think Nolan found it elsewhere. That's what draws the ire of Poseidon, which then follows them on the rest of their trip. So
Yeah.
him shooting the Cyclops is what pisses off Poseidon, and they don't really literalize that in the movie, if I remember correctly, but it's just sort of loosely suggested. But I think in that all works better if the Cyclops is a bit of a cipher and is just a hurdle of, oh, this is the next thing we have to beat before we get to the next, and then, and then, and then. And by humanizing the Cyclops, it kind of makes it so that we don't need all of those literary set dressings, where instead it's just we end up feeling the emotion of the Cyclops, and that sets off what the No Man pun would have done. That sets off the whole we have now pissed off Poseidon. It sets up all of that without having it rely on text, which to me is a sign of a strong adaptation because a film isn't relying on text, it's relying on the alchemy of all the pieces of film, whereas a text really can only be what you read. And to me, that's a very smart thing. And even though the purists don't really like that, to me, it's the same as The Shining, King versus Kubrick, where it's like, dude made the best movie version, dude made the best book version. They're just going to have to change. There's no connection there. And I
Mm,
think that's what we're seeing here.
yeah. Well, and I arguably I would say better than a smug pun from Odysseus is the moment where the Cyclops is weeping quietly to his father Poseidon in the dark in his cave because he doesn't know what happened to him. Like for me, that's more powerful because what that does instead of showing the superiority of Odysseus, which arguably he doesn't have at this point, because he is murdering a living thing, he made a dumb mistake.
Mhm.
We've turned it around and we've said, well, yes, Odysseus did defeat him, but he did it by doing horrible things to a creature in order to be able to survive. And so like there's that sort of messiness of the reality of the circumstance, that doesn't all heroes' journeys have victims. We just don't get to see them. There was a messiness to reminding you of like in a hero's journey, there are victims that the hero leaves behind. Ultimately did with the Trojan horse.
It brings us back to that thematic question of what's the acceptable loss when you're chasing victory. And we see it all the time when the powers that be talk about war, and you go, well, what about all these kids that died? And they go, well, things happen in war. It is
Mm-hmm.
what it is. And it's like, it's not really a good answer.
Yeah,
But,
I'm not happy with that
yeah,
summation.
that doesn't feel nice to me. But,
Yeah.
it's the
Well,
same thing here is where you are now forced to ask the question, did he really need to hurt the Cyclops further? And the answer is no, but he got cocky about it and did it. But if someone were to ask Odysseus in that moment, why did you do that? And his answer would be a very, American warhawk of, well, we can't have a world where there's Cyclopses running around. And it's like, maybe we can, because you didn't even know he was there, and he didn't affect your life none until you showed up. He was just taking care of his adorable sheep.
yeah, you shoved yourself into his story and then got mad when he reacted like the main character.
Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting about this movie is that while it is in its totality, it is an epic. It is also in chapters completely different genres, and I think there are two chapters that are very horror driven. Circe sequence where the men are transformed as they eat a meal, which is clearly body horror driven, and then
Yeah.
I think another horror sequence, a dread sequence, which is them going to the prophecy, getting the prophecy from those who have passed on beyond them. I'm curious what you think. We finally got some horror from Christopher Nolan, who has been sort of always nibbling at the edges with some of his darker thrillers, but never really diving into the pool of horror. How did you feel about those sequences?
I love when filmmakers do that. Like one of my favorite things in the world is when in the middle of a movie Spielberg reminds you that he's a killer horror director that
Mm-hmm.
hasn't really made an out and out horror movie. Like his closest is Jaws, and that's more of an adventure film. So I love whenever a filmmaker shows some horror chops because you and I we're horror filmmakers. There's a certain art to trying to evoke fear from somebody, and it doesn't always work. And horror is beloved because I think audiences chase that, but that is a very precarious line to walk because, I mean, I've seen it happen a million times where you go to see a horror movie and people go, that wasn't scary. In fact, it was kind of funny. And you scoff at it. And so I love when a filmmaker who's not ostensibly a horror filmmaker suddenly shows off horror chops. And I think that it's very effective here. I was legit freaked out by the pig scene. Body horror always gets me. And I think that I would like to see an out and out horror movie from Nolan. Like I kind of want him to go to do the opposite of Peter Jackson. I want to see him take a low budget, just gnarly horror movie, apply his obsessive filmmaking panache to it, and
Mm.
then boom, knock it out of the park. But yeah, I think that this was very horrifying. That said, when they had the scene with the prophecy where everyone came back from the dead to talk, I wasn't really thinking of a horror movie when Elliot Page is covered in mud and muck and all that, I all I could think of was Come and See.
Mm.
It was
Which,
very
I mean,
visual.
there are those who make the argument that that is also a horror movie of a different.
I mean, it's one of the most horrifying movies I've ever seen, regardless of whatever genre you decide to label it as. But I saw Come and See, which is a movie that is about the excesses of war and the people who ain't had anything to do with the war dealing with the repercussions of it. And so it is, if Nolan was trying to visually shout that out, I would I would say it makes sense to the theme and everything. But it's, if I were to close my eyes and think about the scenes that stick out to me the most in this film, it's that one. I mean, really, Elliot Page covered in ashy, mucky muck. That's just a visual that I can't shake, and it's just it's so horrific, and it's such a simple thing, just an actor covered in mud. But man, is it scary!
I had a similar visceral reaction to the Cersei sequence. First of all, he does this with anything that's horrific in this movie. Is that there's a grounded, physical, real world nature to a lot of it. They feel like they're in a real space. The ultimate revelation of the sequence is that it feels thematically like what we're talking about here is about the way that men hurt women, and this woman who has been hurt and who is meting out what she believes to be the right punishment to all men for what has been done to her by men. And what I thought was really powerful about the way they showed the transformation is I don't know if they ever referenced that she shaped them in the story. They ate and then they transformed into pigs. But I
Yeah,
don't know
that's
that
how
they
I
ever
always
said anything
understood it.
about her. But the idea of her putting her hands on them and her manhandling them physically is a very clever inversion of what we think of when we think of issues of rape and sexual assault, which is men wielding physical power over another person's body, and in this case, usually transforming something about them emotionally or mentally. But in this case, it was a reversal where she was doing it to the men and transforming them physically, and I thought that was a really powerful sort of reverse symbolism. This is one of the first times I've ever seen body horror used mostly symbolically, and then
I would
coupled with
agree
Samantha Morton's
100%.
performance.
When I think too, a trope of like the women taking back their power, especially in a situation that is commenting on the oppression of men over women based in just inherent physical strength. That's just something that's not going to go anywhere, unfortunately, because it's like there is one gender that is typically broad strokes going to be physically stronger, and that's where that fear, that's where the choose the bear comes from. It's just
Mm-hmm.
like at the end of the day, I know that if it comes to blows, there's a chance that this dude can really hurt me. And as a result, whenever you see a magical female character sort of taking that back, the way that like a witch, for lack of better term, handles this is through spells and sing songs and Eye of Newt and all that. So to have it be like I am physically molding your bones, beyond that being just a profoundly effective, gut wrenching physical symbolism to look at, I think it really gets to that point of like it shows her rage. It shows that it's not, oh, I'm a magic fairy who's taking it back. It feels much more grounded, real, and I would imagine if a woman were to watch this with that thematic weight in mind, that much more cathartic too.
Yeah.
It's a
Somewhat a trickster character because I think even that they have like an affair and stuff. And in the movie, she's not a trickster character. She's a driven woman who has done this specifically because of harms that have been meted on her by someone else. And I thought that was really powerful.
and I
Well,
do love
so the
that
last,
Odysseus is like, "Oh, you want me to kill that bird?
yeah,
Because I'll kill that bird. I don't know who that is, but it's just a bird now. I'll rip its head off." I was like,
yeah.
"Oh, geez, he means business."
Yeah. Again, uniquely American reaction to something.
Yeah,
I can't get power over you, so I'm going to threaten the least powerful person in the room in defense of it.
but
So the last thing I wanted to discuss before we start to wrap out is the one genre I did not expect to pop up in the final act of the movie, which is the John Wick style revenge
yeah,
action movie.
the Bollywood
Were
musical.
were you expecting that at all? Like I knew what the final sort of trial situation was, and I could see how they could wring tension out of that. I did not expect the sequence that we got.
Kind of assumed that this being a blockbuster, it had to deliver some sort of dynamic action sequence that wasn't like a big sweeping thing. On the other hand, I didn't expect it because, and this is a bugaboo I've had with Nolan since day one, I think he is just no good at shooting fistfights. The fistfights across the Batman trilogy are uniquely terrible and universally terrible. I enjoy them for what they are, but they're just it's just a skill he doesn't have. I think the best I've seen him do is Tenet, and even those aren't necessarily great. They're sort of more exciting because they're relying on the gimmick of a backwards guy fighting a forwards guy. That's neat, but you look at the choreography and John Wick, it is not.
Hmm.
And where I think that this big fight with the suitors at the end, I think it's well conceived and well executed in terms of who fights who and when, who goes down who and when. Like on a macro level, he's good. When it comes down to the nuts and bolts of fists and knives connecting, it did not work for me as well as I'd hoped. That said, I thought it was a cool read on the scene to just go, instead of a nightclub, it's the dining hall. And, these guys are going to wick it up for a little bit. I'm never not going to love that, even if I think this is the one area where Nolan's craft tends to stumble a little.
Hmm. I wonder if that's the reason why, no matter how hard he tries, he has not gotten the call for Bond yet.
Yeah, I mean,
Because there's certain things you just got to get right in James Bond, and that's probably one of them. So
and he
you
would
know,
get everything else right. Because, like, when it comes to large scale action, there's few better than Nolan. I mean, he folded Paris into a cube, and it was awesome. And that was, what, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? And it's still like a defining, beautiful piece of, like, what I can do molding a giant world. The boats on the water in this, the whirlpool, even, when they're going through the fjord and the tentacles are grabbing people, like, that's sick, awesome action. But as soon as it's two people squaring up to fight, gobbledygook. And that's also just kind of a personal bugaboo I have in a post-Paul Greengrass world. As a Jackie Chan fan, I want to see the poetry of the fight. Whereas, like, a Paul Greengrass type is like, we'll just shake the camera and then you don't have to worry about the choreography. And then the Marvel movies adopted that because they didn't have time to train all of their superstars for 6 months. They just have to do their best and then shoot around it. Nolan has the freedom and the ability to really nail that. And I think he puts in the time and the work, but it's just a visual skill I don't think he has. Maybe he'll get it one day, but that's like my one big bugaboo with him throughout his whole career.
I can concede that that's true too. I was mostly pleased that we had the sequence and that they decided to go in that direction, because I mostly thought it was going to be like a, is it literally just going to be an arrow shooting contest, or how is that going to work? But ultimately, I like the way it paid off. But as we wrap out, I don't know if there's any final thoughts that you have. The one final thought I had, as a pet owner, as a dog owner in particular, is that the movie broke my heart with Argus the dog. Man, brutal stuff.
Brutal for
And
him, and then also for Argus's brother, who just immediately gets thrown off a cliff right at the
yeah,
beginning.
that was rough. I
I
surprised dark horse fantastic performance from John Leguizamo that I
was
didn't even
hoping
know
you'd
he was
bring
in
him
it
up.
until like 2 days before I saw it.
Same. John Leguizamo, I think, is with time going to go down as one of the greats. He is truly vaudevillian in that everything he touches, he's able to do. Even in like something stupid like Spawn, you watch John Leguizamo and go, that dude showed up and like dug deep to deliver that stupid clown character. I mean, growing up as a kid, it's an objectively bad movie, but I loved The Pest. And that movie is not good, but not for lack of Leguizamo's talent. He is batting 1,000 in that nonstop. And yeah, here I would be surprised if he didn't get like a supporting nom for this movie.
Are there any final thoughts about the movie that you want to throw out?
I got to thinking about when we hear Trojan horse, we do often associate it with the condom brand. And I got to thinking that that's actually not a good name for the condom brand because it's based in the idea of we're gonna sneak your little guys in there and that way they can get past the defense and then release them. That's bad for Trojan because that suggests the condom breaking,
Yeah.
which is what we don't want.
Yeah.
All my little guys, I don't want them in there because they might create a child that I don't
Mm-hmm.
want. I also don't want any potential, even littler guys in the form of STDs going the other way. And like the Trojan horse, as the story would represent, is I want to get all those guys in there, but they don't want them in there, so I'm going to sneak them in this way, which is so dark if you think about it.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
it's both the best and worst branding. But the other thing I wanted to bring up is there are so many adaptations of the Odyssey that people love that aren't one to one with the Odyssey. The most prominent being "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?"
Mm-hmm.
Which is actually that was my first exposure to the Odyssey. The first time I saw that movie, I didn't get it because I wasn't aware of what they were doing. And I just thought it was a silly movie. And then once I understood the Odyssey and saw it again, it like blew my mind. Uh, Even to the point now where like there's a meme going around of Matt Damon in the Odyssey being like, "But I'm a Dapper Dan man," and someone pointed this out online, and it really kind of made me laugh, which was like, the Wizard of Oz is the Odyssey, and by proxy, Dougie Jones trying to get back to being Coop in Twin Peaks: The Return is an Odyssey riff in a way.
Yeah.
And like he's trying to get back, and so watching Twin Peaks: The Return, especially when everyone was just expecting Special Agent Dale Cooper to just start kicking ass right away, and instead we get Dougie for like 10 episodes, and then Coop right at the end for a little bit, which is just the ultimate troll move from Lynch. Mad respect. I would imagine influenced by the Odyssey, even down to in Twin Peaks the got a light. That is very much just like, oh, creatures of the night coming out, proving a hurdle. But it all traces back thematically to that one thing in the middle of episode 8, The Returns. What unleashed all of the evil from the Black Lodge?
Yep.
Oppenheimer, baby.
Yep.
And like, as soon as I started thinking about that, and as a Twin Peaks obsessive, and thinking about how that all of that sort of ties together, it is wild that at the core of everything Nolan does really comes down to Oppenheimer making the first nuke. It's that Twin Peaks thing. What a crazy pull! I wish I could credit whoever said that on like I think it was on Threads because it never would have occurred to me, and it just makes the most sense.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining me, Dan. I love
Yeah,
talking
thank you.
about
This
this,
was
and
fun. I
yeah,
could
we'll
go
have to do
on
this
for
again
another
sometime
two
soon.
hours. This is good because I haven't written my Odyssey review yet, and every time I sit down, I bang out like 700 words, and I go, I don't know what I'm talking about. I think I got to see this again. But I'm hoping that the powers that be aren't mad that my review hasn't published until like a week after I initially saw it, because I just got to see it again.
Yeah.
But this conversation really helped, and it's going to open up some new ideas when I sit down
Awesome.
to write it. I'll end on this. We all joke like Christopher Nolan wants you to see this in the biggest screen possible, blah blah blah, he's elitist and all that. But what I think is true about this movie is that yes, go see it on the biggest screen you possibly can. But if you were to watch it on an Apple Watch, it's still going to rock your world.
Yeah. It's going to be good on any screen.
Yeah.